Hey everyone, welcome back to Engelbart Gaming. You know, there are some things that people say on the internet that take on a life of their own and sort of become the recognized, accepted, unchallenged truth, whether they're true or not. I know, crazy, right? If only I'd told you sooner. Well, in today's video, I'm going to look at one such statement that's been floating around the retro gaming and emulation communities for over 20 years now. And that statement goes something like this: Sega's arcade ports and original games are better on the PC Engine than they are on the Genesis. It sounds preposterous on its face, but is there any truth to that? Well, there's really only one way to find out, right? In today's episode, I'm going to be looking at 16 games that appeared on both systems and comparing them directly. I'm even going to throw in a few bonus games at the end. Now, I have 3 rules for this video. Rule number 1. I'm only going to look at the same game on both systems, or in instances where the same game's not available, I'm going to look at a game and its very similar sequel on the two systems. Rule number 2. I'm only going to be looking at games that were developed by Sega or are at least closely associated with Sega. This means I'm not just going to look at any games that appear on both platforms, only ones that were made by Sega or associated with them. So stuff like Street Fighter II is out, while stuff like Puyo Puyo is in. The third and final rule is I'm only going to look at commercial releases on both systems. Now there is one circumstance where I'm going to show you a homebrew game, but it's not going to count and factor into the tally. Wait a minute, what tally? Glad you asked. Well, I'm going to decide which system has the best versions of each game and keep a running score. So I'll either decide a game in favor of the Genesis, in favor of the PC Engine, or it'll be a draw if we have cases where the game is just so similar on the two platforms that it doesn't really make sense to declare one a winner over the other. And that's about it. Let's get on with it then, shall we? We begin with Afterburner II. The original was one of Sega's amazingly advanced superscalar arcade games. Home systems at the time could not bring home the complex graphics of the arcade game, and frankly, the attempts before the 16-bit era were pretty terrible. Things had definitely improved by the time the Genesis and PCE came around, however, so we've got the Genesis version on the left and the PC Engine version on the right. On PC Engine, this game only came out in Japan. At first glance, you might think that the PC Engine version is superior. It runs at a higher frame rate, the stuff on the ground is a little larger and more detailed as well. And those are definite positives. Now let's look at the Genesis version. The ground is less detailed, but the software scaling they used on the aircrafts in the sky is excellent and much smoother than on PC Engine. Also, the control is dramatically more fluid and much finer in the Genesis version. This makes it a lot easier to lock onto enemies in the distance, and you have multiple options on the Genesis controller's 3 action buttons for handling speed changes, which makes control in this version a breeze. Now overall, this first game is a bit of a close call. The PC Engine version is a little more authentic to the arcade game in some ways, like having the scaling carrier at the beginning and the quick landing scenes on the runway. But when it comes to gameplay and sound, the Genesis version is clearly on top. They're both good games, but I'd say the Genesis version was the best port of the era, followed closely by the PC Engine version. So Sega Genesis?
You win!
Our second game is Altered Beast. This game originally appeared on the Sega System 16 arcade board, and was famously packed in with the Genesis when that system launched. Now we've got the Genesis version on the left here, and if you look at it, you can see that the color leaves a bit to be desired. While most of the main player and enemy sprites are smaller on the PC Engine, there are a few that are smaller on Genesis, such as the wolves. The Genesis version added multiple layers of parallax scrolling that were not even present in the arcade original, giving the game a lot of graphical depth missing from other versions. The control in the Genesis version is great, owing largely to the fact that the Genesis controller has the correct number of action buttons to play this game, which is 3. The sound is very close to the arcade game too. Sadly, the sprite scaling from the arcade game is gone from this version and every other home version of the time. Now on PC Engine, it might seem like this game looks pretty good, but frankly, that's overshadowed by the fact that it plays like garbage. Often when you take a hit in this version, you'll just bounce around into another enemy and take another hit, and this will just keep repeating until you die. Also, this will often cause you to easily miss those white wolves that you need to take out in order to get the power-up orbs that you need to transform, which is necessary to complete the level. Well, sorta. It'll eventually end if you don't transform, but that's not the goal. The music is kind of grating on PC Engine as well. And before you say, hey, there's a CD version. Yeah, I know that, but guess what? They use the CD audio for sound effects, not music. The PCE CD version has the same bad music as the HuCard version. In still shots, PC Engine Altered Beast looks like a winner. But the gameplay is marred by the lack of a jump button, enemies that behave strangely compared to the arcade and Genesis versions. For your main characters, you have weirdly slow walking coupled with super fast walking animation and just more general oddities. Also, when you do jump in this game, your character pauses for like a second in a crouch position, making you incredibly vulnerable to cheap hits. This one is not even close. Sega Genesis Altered Beast.
You win!
Next up, Bonanza Brothers. And I have a confession for you, I was never a fan of Bonanza Brothers. I just couldn't get into this game with its weird application of stealth and its slow pace. I've played pretty much all the versions of it for systems and computers I've owned throughout the years though. So on the left we have the Genesis version. It's a decent port of the arcade game, lacking a bit in the resolution and color departments, and it's missing the scaling of the arcade version along with the bonus rounds and some other stuff. Gameplay-wise, it feels really solid and pretty close to the arcade original. Moving into and out of the background seems a tad abrupt in the home version compared to the original arcade game, and in some ways, this one has been toned down a little bit difficulty-wise, which you could see is either a positive or negative depending on your point of view. On the right, we have the PC Engine version, which wasn't released in the US. As you can see, this one also looks pretty decent, nailing the weird, clean, geometric look of the arcade original. Much like on Genesis, it lacks the scaling of the arcade game, and the bit of parallax present from both the arcade and Genesis versions is absent from this one. It does, however, have the bonus rounds. It's a good enough version of the game that I can't imagine any fans would have been disappointed with it when it was new. Now I'm going to do the unthinkable here and declare that Bonanza Brothers is basically a push. There are a few minor things that are better in the Genesis version, and there are a few minor things that are better on the PC Engine CD version. So,
Alright, we'll call it a draw.
next up, Columns. Sega did not invent the game Columns. They bought it from a guy named Jay Gearston that made it for a computer back in 1989. Did you know that? Well, you do now. There's more to that story, but it's beyond the scope of what I'm covering today. Sega released Columns both in the arcade and on the Genesis. The Genesis version would later appear in basically identical form on the Sega CD. There were also Sega Master System and Game Gear versions around the same time. As you can see, the Genesis version on the left looks and plays nice enough for a simple puzzle game. The music is definitely memorable, and I spent quite a lot of time playing the Sega CD version back in the day, trying to see how many chains I could pull off. Columns is a definite classic that doesn't quite get the respect it deserves. It's often overshadowed by bigger names in the genre like Tetris and Puyo Puyo. On the right, we have the PC Engine version of Columns, which was a Japanese exclusive. It was made for Telenet by Wolf Team/Lasersoft. Yep, that Wolf Team. As you can see, they did a fine job with it, and it's really close to the original Genesis version. I do have to say the controls feel a little more sluggish on PCE than they do on Genesis, and the sound has suffered a noticeable downgrade. Because of those things, I'd have to say that while Columns is really good on both platforms, it's definitely better on Genesis. So, Sega Genesis,
You win!
Next up, Fantasy Zone. And this is our first game that isn't like for like on each platform. On the left, we have Super Fantasy Zone for the Mega Drive, and on the right, Fantasy Zone for the PC Engine. I'll also throw in a little bit of SMS Fantasy Zone for reference. Now, Mega Drive's Super Fantasy Zone looks very similar to the original arcade Fantasy Zone. It's colorful, it has a lot of on-screen enemies, it has parallax scrolling, and some very large enemies, particularly the bosses. A lot of people will tell you that this is their favorite Fantasy Zone game, and it's not hard to see why. It looks great, it sounds great, and in my opinion, plays the best of the three main games in the series. I'm definitely not the biggest Fantasy Zone fan, but I've played all the games in the series on multiple platforms and can appreciate it and what Sega and Sunsoft accomplished with this title. On the right, we have the PC Engine / Turbografx-16 version. This is the original Fantasy Zone, and this one actually did come to the US. It basically looks like an NES game with bigger sprites and less flicker. It loses most of the parallax scrolling, although it does have some faux parallax here and there. The music can be really abrasive in this version, and in general, it looks just like what it is. A game running on a slightly souped-up 8-bit system. That's not to say that it's bad, it isn't, it's fun to play through, and it's better than the 8-bit versions that appeared on either the SMS or NES. But it's just not in the same league as the arcade original or the Genesis version of Super Fantasy Zone. Here's Sega Master System Fantasy Zone, which you can tell is clearly inferior to the PC Engine release. It's not a super dramatic step down from that version in most ways, but yeah, it definitely has the hallmarks of 8-bit systems, such as clearing the screen for the bosses since they are backgrounds in that version. Anyway, back to the two games we're actually comparing to wrap this up. So in the end, this is another clear victory for the Sega Genesis game. Sega Genesis?
You win!
Alright, let's take our first little break here. So far, I've looked at 5 games on both systems, and I've found that 4 of those games were better on Genesis, 0 were better on PC Engine, and 1 was a draw where it was pretty much even between the two. Now I understand some of you out there will disagree, and that's fine. We don't have to be angry about it or anything. Just feel free to drop me a comment. Tell me why you think the way that you think and why you would support deciding things a different way. I'd love to hear it, and I'm sure everyone in the community of this channel would love to hear it. Alright, let's move on. Next up, GameGround. GameGround is kind of a weird game. It's sort of a more strategic run and gun that takes place on single-screen levels. The pace is slow, and you're encouraged to think about the best way to complete levels rather than just charging through them. It's not a normal action game, it's not a normal strategy game. It's somewhere in between. The Genesis version captures the design and scale of the arcade game very well. The arcade game was on a vertically oriented screen. The Genesis mimics this by taking the main action and putting it in a window in the center of the screen, and then puts info and status indicators on either side of it. It maintains the feel of the arcade game pretty much perfectly. Again, this isn't one of my favorites, but the Genesis version is challenging and sticks close to the gameplay roots of the original. It also adds 10 more levels to the arcade release. On the right, we have the Japanese-only GameGround SX on PC Engine CD. This game is zoomed way the hell in, which really screws with the level design. Now, PC Engine GameGround is one of those games where you'll see people praise it and say it's the best home port of GameGround on any system. But I have to disagree. For GameGround, being able to see the entire playfield is essential. There are times you'll need to know what's off-screen in this version, so you don't get surprised or killed the second you scroll either up or down. There are just too many situations where you have to run into something blind in this version of the game, and it really hurts its whole strategic vibe. Visually, it looks good on PC Engine CD, the music is decent, but I will also say that the collision detection feels a bit off. Now, it is an interesting take on the game, but I feel like it's hurt by the decision to zoom in so much on the playfield. Because of that, and the collision detection issues, I have to give this one to the Genesis. Sega Genesis?
You win!
Game number 7 in our list is Golden Axe. The arcade version of Golden Axe ran on Sega's System 16 board and was basically a fantasy version of Double Dragon. And, well, it was awesome! The Genesis version is also awesome. The PC Engine CD version isn't. I did a complete trash episode on that one if you want to look at it, but let's not get ahead of ourselves here. Genesis Golden Axe is an imperfect but well done port. It captures the spirit of the arcade game pretty much perfectly if nothing else. Some of the levels are truncated slightly, but the game makes up for that a bit by adding 2 new levels at the end of the game that were not present in the arcade original. It loses the occasional parallax scrolling from the arcade game, and also a lot of tile detail due to the tiny cartridge size. But really, Sega did an amazing job of squeezing the much larger arcade experience into an early and itty-bitty 512K Genesis cartridge. PC Engine CD Golden Axe is another port by Telenet/Lasersoft, and oh my god, what a mess they made of this game. It's only one player, The graphics are terrible, the music is just so-so, the sound effects are some of the worst I've ever heard on the system, and the gameplay? Oh, there should be a new word invented to describe the level of atrocity that has been committed by PC Engine CD's Golden Axe gameplay. How about it's a-trowable? Anyway, it's even worse than Altered Beast. This game has essentially no redeeming qualities, and the fact that it got released in this state is absolutely mind-boggling. So Sega Genesis?
You win!
Next up, we have a compile game, which I'm including because it's sort of in the Puyo series, which is now owned by Sega. And this game is Mado Monogatari, Sorcery Saga 1. First off, both of these games were only released in Japan. What you're seeing here are fan translations. There are also 3 games in the series for the Game Gear, which all have fan translations now as well. Mado Monogatari is a 3D dungeon crawler on both platforms. But while these games share the same basic name and concept, which includes guiding a little girl through the practical part of an exam, the play mechanics are significantly different in each. In the Genesis version, combat plays out with almost Street Fighter-style command inputs, while on PC Engine, it uses a more traditional turn-based RPG combat system via menus. Combat in the Genesis version is done in a side view, assisting its Street Fighter-y nature, while on PC Engine CD, it's done from a first-person perspective, much like Phantasy Star or Dragon Quest. In this case, the games are so fundamentally different, I can't tell you that one is just simply better than the other. Really, it'll all boil down to which combat system you prefer, and this is a case where reasonable people can definitely disagree. Now personally, I prefer the combat in the Genesis game since it's much more unique for an RPG, but I know that it won't be for everyone, and doing those special motions over and over again on the gamepad can get tedious. I can also see some people preferring the more standard RPG combat of the PCE game, but that is also, of course, repetitive in its own way. Visually, I think the Sega version stands out a bit more. When it comes to music, the PCE CD version might have a slight edge. Overall though, what can I say?
Alright, we'll call it a draw.
Sega's famous superscalar arcade game Outrun is an undeniable classic. It may be the most recognizable driving game ever made to this day. The complicated hardware that ran this game was considerably more advanced than the meager PC Engine or Sega Genesis, and we wouldn't see a quote-unquote perfect port of Outrun for one more console generation beyond this one. Let's talk about the PC Engine version first, which only came out in Japan. PCE Outrun has a reputation for being excellent that is, in my opinion, completely unearned. I can only guess that people didn't know about this game when it was new, so they flocked to it when emulation became available and were really surprised that it wasn't total garbage and got a little overexcited about it. PC Engine Outrun isn't bad by any stretch. It's a decent take on Outrun considering the hardware, but it suffers from some flicker, some smaller vehicles and roadside objects, and it also has a whole host of missing roadside stuff, particularly the water on the left side of Stage 1. People praise the color in the PC Engine version, but it's way off, and the engine noise may have been created by Satan himself. The unfairly maligned Genesis port is actually pretty damn good. It's much closer to the arcade version, looking like a very similar game running at a lower frame rate. The colors are more similar to the arcade version as well, there's more on-screen stuff with less flicker than the PC Engine version, the road is wider, the control is better, the music is much better, and, well, I guess that's about it. Seriously though, I don't understand why so many people online have been trashing this game over the years. Some reviews were a little harsh when it came out, but that was primarily because they complained it was a quote-unquote old game when it came out in 1991, 5 years after the arcade version. Now that's smack in the middle of that strange no man's land between when games were seen as old and tired, but before they were recognized later as timeless classics. Really, I don't think there's a single thing in this case that the PC Engine version of Outrun does better than the Genesis version. I know this will be my most controversial pick because it goes against the accepted public opinion, but just look at and listen to these two games. Sega Genesis...
You win!
The original Puyo Puyo. The first game in my favorite series of the falling thing puzzle genre. In the West, we know this better as either Dr. Robotnik's Mean Bean Machine on Sega platforms, or Kirby's Avalanche on SNES. Compile, yes, the ones famous for their shooters, developed this super intense competitive puzzle game. Their first take on the genre was a huge success, which is why the series still lives on with new games to this very day. They put out an arcade version based on the Genesis hardware, and it looks and sounds great. It plays great, and I just have nothing bad to say about this game. The Genesis version is outstanding, and I can't even tell you how many hours I put into this game when it was new, playing both solo and against friends. The Genesis version is every bit as good as the arcade game since it ran on basically the same hardware. Now, there were ports to many other systems, including the PC Engine CD. For some reason, they decided not to use CD music in this version, and instead use the medium for voices. Pretty bad decision, if you ask me. Because of that, the music in this version sounds considerably worse than the cartridge-based Genesis game. The control also feels a tad sluggish compared to the ultra-smooth Genesis version, a complaint that I would also level against the SNES port of the game. But, having said that, if I were comparing the PC Engine CD version to the SNES version, I'd say the PCE CD version still comes out on top because it feels less sluggish than that game. The PC Engine CD version also omits the little bit of parallax scrolling from the character intros at the beginning of each stage in the Sega version. I'd also say that the backgrounds are a little more garish in the PCE CD game. The colors are more subtle on the Genesis and Super Nintendo. In the end, which version is better? They're both really good, but because of the slightly smoother gameplay, better music, and nicer backgrounds, this is another easy victory for the Genesis version. Sega Genesis!
You win!
In Japan, Compile blessed the 16-bit era with a second Puyo Puyo game that included some gameplay refinements over the original. That game was known as Puyo Puyo Su, which is sort of a pun, with the Japanese word su, meaning to pass through, being a play on the English word for the number 2. Now, I'm not going to go into all the technical differences between the original Puyo and Su, but probably the most significant one is that in Puyo Puyo Su, sending those nuisance or clear beans to an opponent becomes a tug of war. If you have clear beans at the top of your playfield that have yet to drop, you can negate them quickly by clearing a bunch of Puyos on your board. If you get a large combo, you'll reverse course and actually send nuisance Puyos to your opponent after clearing all yours. And your opponent then has the opportunity to do the same to you. This mechanic has stuck with the series since this release. Now, once again, there's an arcade version that runs on hardware very similar to the Genesis/Mega Drive. Because of this, the Mega Drive port is nearly identical to the arcade game. It looks and sounds great, and primarily due to the gameplay enhancement I just described, is even more fun and intense than the original, especially with 2 players. This one leans a little more into character voices than the original. Like the prior game in the series, this one was also ported to the PC Engine CD format, and I've got to ask, what the hell happened here? They took out the backgrounds, so the game takes place in what is pretty much just a plain black space. And then once again they decided to use PCE chiptunes for the music and put voices on the CD. This is the second time that they've made this frankly baffling decision. Gameplay is basically fine, and the control feels pretty on par with the original release on PCE CD, which means it's not quite as smooth as the Genesis port. So this is yet another instance where the win easily goes to the Genesis version. Sega Genesis!
You win!
Alright, time for our second break. At this point, we're 11 games in. Right now, I've got it scored where 9 games were better on Genesis, 0 better on PC Engine, and 2 that are a draw. Well, I have to say the statement that all of the Sega ports are games that were original on PC Engine being better than the Genesis ports, I think we can safely bust that myth at this point. We've still got a few more games to go through though, so let's go ahead and jump back in and finish this up, shall we? Next up, Shinobi. Sega's classic System 16 ninja game, Shinobi, was absolutely fantastic back in the day. Now, there's no version of Shinobi for the Genesis. Or is there? Haha, watch on, viewer. To start with, I'm showing you Shadow Dancer on the Genesis versus Shinobi on the PCE. PC Engine Shinobi was developed by Asmik. Don't be deceived, for while it may look decent on the surface, it's missing a lot of stuff from the original arcade game. I did an utterly pointless comparisons where I looked at the complete versions of both the PCE and arcade Shinobi, and you can find that up above or below in the description. As a quick summary, PC Engine Shinobi removes the melee attacks from the arcade game, the gun power-up, the bonus rounds, the entirety of Mission 2, a whole bunch of enemies, and more. Yeah, this one is really kind of a train wreck. Shadow Dancer is the only official Shinobi series game on the Genesis that actually plays like the arcade original. Revenge of Shinobi and Shinobi 3 play very differently. Genesis Shadow Dancer uses the same basic play mechanics as the original arcade Shinobi. You have your throwing stars that you use to attack from a distance, melee attacks for close-up attacks, you rescue hostages, you get a power-up from one of those hostages, similar to the gun from the original game, you fight bosses, you have bonus rounds after you complete every mission, and so on. Now if we look at these two games, we can see that Genesis Shadow Dancer is much more faithful to the arcade version of Shinobi than the actual port of Shinobi for the PC Engine. But there's something else we can look at here. What's this? Well, this is a homebrew version of the arcade Shinobi that's been in development for the Sega Genesis. It has 4 levels, it includes the melee attack, and it's even got the bonus round. It doesn't yet have any bosses or the gun/sword power-ups. But at least it shows you what could have been a pretty excellent version of Shinobi running on the Genesis. It looks, sounds, and plays wonderfully even at this stage of development. Sega should have given us a game like this back in the day. Overall, this was such a super promising demo, and I just love to see the game completed someday. Anyway, back to the main comparison here. So that's Shadow Dancer again on the left now. When it comes to commercial releases that play like the arcade version of Shinobi, pitting the PC Engine version of Shinobi against the Genesis version of Shadow Dancer, it isn't even close. Sega Genesis?
You win!
One of Sega's earliest superscalar heavy hitters was this game right here, Space Harrier. Man, the arcade version of Space Harrier looked insane when it was new. It was light years ahead of basically everything else in the arcade. Now Sega didn't release Space Harrier for the Genesis, but they did put out Space Harrier II, which was incredibly similar to the original. Let's talk about the PC Engine / Turbografx-16 version of the original Space Harrier. And yes, unlike most of the games in this episode, this one was released in the US. Now Space Harrier on the PC Engine was never going to be close to the super powerful arcade game. Still, this version commits the unforgivable sin of getting rid of Space Harrier's most noteworthy visual, the checkerboard floor. It replaces it with plain horizontal lines. Next up, the characters and enemies are small in this version. The music is a little on the meh side of things. The control is okay and the game is fast, but overall, I'd say this is just an okay version of Space Harrier. It's better than pretty much all the prior versions of Space Harrier, and it's certainly not bad, it's just decent. Space Harrier II was a launch game for the Genesis. Since the Genesis hardware lacked sprite scaling abilities, this one was also never going to be close to the arcade Space Harrier on a technical level. As one of the earliest Genesis games ever programmed, it was also done by a team that wasn't yet experienced with the new hardware. And still, I have to say that I prefer this game to PC Engine Space Harrier. The characters are larger, the enemies are larger, we have a smooth checkerboard floor, some huge bosses, and decent music. Yeah, Harrier's movement is choppy, and the frame rate could definitely have been a little nicer, but between this game and PC Engine Space Harrier, this is definitely the one that I'd rather play. One thing people always knock about this game is its length. The original Space Harrier had 18 levels, and this one only has 13. But wait! You see, in the original Space Harrier, it counts the bonus stages as levels. In Space Harrier 2, it doesn't. So if you add the bonus levels to Space Harrier 2's level count, it's actually got 15 levels. Only 3 less than the original. Anyway, Sega Genesis?
You win!
Next up, Thunderblade. Sega's Thunderblade was one of the most astounding arcade games I'd ever seen when it was new. The sense of depth and smoothness was unmatched by anything else at the time, and it would remain Sega's most visually spectacular arcade game until they later released Galaxy Force 1 and 2, which were even more impressive. Thunderblade ran on hardware using a whopping 368,000 CPUs, along with specialized sprite scaling hardware and lots of other impressive tech. This was a game that no home system of the time could duplicate successfully. First up, on the right, as usual, we have the PC Engine version of Thunderblade, which was only released in Japan. The developers have done a decent job simulating the 3D look of the arcade original. The buildings and the overhead scene move in a similar way to the arcade game, even though this version is choppier. It's missing the speed controls from the arcade game though, which does hamper the gameplay a bit. The third-person view scenes are kinda so-so, but overall, considering the hardware, you probably couldn't have hoped for much more from a PC Engine port of Thunderblade. It's pretty severely cut back, and I wouldn't recommend playing it these days, but for the time it came out, it was alright. Now on the Genesis, we're taking a look at Super Thunderblade, which was one of the very first games developed for the Mega Drive/Genesis, and it shows. The graphics aren't all that impressive. The control is stiff, feeling like the chopper just has too much weight to it. They got rid of the overhead scenes from the arcade game entirely. They did add in some boss fights to the third-person scenes to make up for it. Genesis Super Thunderblade also has more going on simultaneously than the PC Engine version, which you can especially see in the caves in the second area. The sound and music are better in Genesis Super Thunderblade as well. So which is the better game? Overall, this one is just really close. Much closer than the internet would have you believe. But after fully sizing up both games, PC Engine, for the first time today,
You win!
Next up, Wonder Boy 3 Monster Lair, or just Monster Lair. The complicated history of Wonder Boy. Now this is the port of the third Wonder Boy arcade game, Monster Lair. It's basically an action shooter that incorporates the energy bar and fruit grabbing mechanic of the first game in the series. Personally, I would say this is the second worst game in the Wonder Boy series, behind the dull as dishwater original. Now, right off the bat, there are things that are more impressive about the Genesis version, and it resembles the arcade one more on a technical level, helped a lot, for example, by its parallax scrolling. The sound is similar to the arcade version, and the controls are fine. On the downside, the sprites look a little off in this version compared to the arcade original, and sadly this port is also missing 2 levels. However, some of the weapons and power-ups look better and fill the screen more in this game than its CD-based cousin on the PC Engine/Turbografx. Check out the fully expanded ring weapon for an example of that. Now on PC Engine/Turbografx-CD, Monster Lair is pretty well done for what it is. This one also did come to the US. The color is nice, the sprite work is well done, and it looks closer to the arcade original. The Red Book audio is decent, and the gameplay is fine. Some of the weapon effects are worse than those in the Genesis version, but on the flip side, this version does have all of the levels. It lacks the parallax scrolling of both the arcade and Genesis games, which does hurt this version visually quite a lot. In the end, this is another surprisingly tough decision. The loss of parallax on PCE is pretty brutal for that version of the game, but I think the slightly off sprites and the loss of 2 levels from the Genesis port give the PCE CD game the upper hand in this case. So I'm gonna say, PC Engine,
You win!
the final game in my Sega-related Genesis vs. PC Engine comparison is Wonder Boy in Monster World. On Genesis, this is known as Wonder Boy 5 Wonder Boy in Monster World. On the PC Engine, this game is known as Dynastic Hero, or at least it is in the US, this one was released here as well. In still shots, this game looks incredibly similar on both platforms, and you'd be hard-pressed to tell the games apart. On the Genesis version, it has nice bright colors that stood out from many of its contemporary, grungier, more realistic-looking titles. It also had decent music and interesting gameplay, being an early entry into what we would today refer to as the Metroidvania genre. You run around a connected map, you can see things you can't reach yet, you eventually find items or power-ups that unlock something that gives you access to reach those items, and you can go back to those areas. Or you'll unlock a new area, and so on. This underrated game is really wonderful, and while it feels a touch archaic these days, I still recommend it, and the Genesis version is great. Really top-notch. On PC Engine/Turbo-CD, we lose the parallax scrolling, of course, and since this game doesn't add anything new, this time it is a major factor. Probably the major differentiating factor between the two games when it comes to visuals. Now the music between these two games is very different as well, and I vastly prefer the music of the Genesis original. We do have Red Book CD audio music here, and it's much higher fidelity, but the composition is worse, and the songs don't fit the areas as well as they do in the original Genesis game. The gameplay is similar between the Genesis and PCE versions, but there's one minor inconvenience that holds back the gameplay a little bit in the PCE CD version, and that's the lack of a third action button. You see, in the Genesis version, you use your third button to either cast spells or use items. On the PC Engine CD version, since you only have 2 action buttons, you have to use the run button, and it's a lot less convenient and you have to reach more and it interrupts the flow of gameplay. So in the end, because of the superior control on Genesis, its parallax scrolling, and its better music, I have to say, Sega Genesis,
You win!
Alright everyone, bonus time! We're going to take a look at 2 more games real quick. I figured we might as well look at the rest of the Wonder Boy games that showed up on the PC Engine. There are no Genesis equivalents to these, so we have to look at the titles for the Sega Master System instead. Because of that, these aren't going to count in the final tally of which game is better on which system, since we're comparing Genesis and PC Engine games, not Master System and PC Engine games. Still, with that in mind, let's jump into these now. Wonder Boy in Monsterland was the second game in the Wonder Boy series, both in the arcade and at home. It's radically different from the first one. This time it's an action platform adventure title, instead of a simple platformer a la Super Mario Brothers like the original. As you can see, the Sega Master System version is serviceable, but it did cut back quite a lot of stuff from the arcade original, particularly where music is concerned. It's a good game on Sega's major 8-bit platform, but if Wonder Boy and Monster World was a bit archaic, this one is downright fossilistic. Is fossilistic a word? It is now. People will probably have a tougher time enjoying Wonder Boy and Monsterland these days if they don't have any nostalgia for it. On PC Engine, because they didn't have the rights to use the name or character of Wonder Boy, we get this sort of weird bug-themed version of it where everything has been reskinned. Despite the reskinning, the quality of the visuals are closer to the arcade game and the sound and music are also much more similar to it than the Sega Master System version. Some people will be rubbed the wrong way by the reskinned characters and bosses, but overall, the PCE plays a decent game of Wonder Boy in Monsterland. Or in this case, Bikuriman World. If you've got the patience to deal with an old game like this one, and learning its enemy and boss patterns, and don't mind the extremely aggressive timer, both of these versions are pretty nice. Even though I'm not scoring these because it's SMS versus PCE in this case, I would definitely give a bit of an edge to the PCE port if I were scoring them. The final game I'm looking at today is Wonder Boy 3: The Dragon's Trap. And here it is, the best game in the Wonder Boy / Monster World series. It started life on the Sega Master System, and it is absolutely one of the single best games on the entire platform. It's sort of proto-Metroidvania-y, but not quite. It's got one continuous world, with stuff you need certain powers to reach, but for the most part the major areas are pretty self-contained, and you don't often have to return to major areas after clearing them, with a few minor exceptions. On the Sega Master System, the game runs at 30 frames per second or half the normal refresh rate of an NTSC system, but other than that, it looks fantastic on the platform. Although I'd recommend the modern remake since it removes a few inconveniences, namely the charm stone requirements for shops, and also adds a few new challenge areas for bonuses. Now, get ready for this one. The PC Engine version of this game in Japan is called Adventure Island. Yeah, as if we needed anything else to increase the confusion in the naming between the Wonder Boy and Adventure Island games. Now we did get this game in the US, and that version was called Dragon's Curse. Dragon's Curse is a direct port of the Sega Master System version, only it's better in every way. We get lovely 60 frames per second fluidity, better sounding music, legit saving if you have a Turbo CD, and it's just great. While there are a few minor visual changes, this time around the game is mostly intact, with just a few of your animal forms looking slightly different from the Sega Master System original. This one still has the Charmstone BS for the shops though. I mean, it would have been nice if they had jazzed this one up a little more using some of the extra power in the PC Engine, but what we got is a fantastic version of Wonder Boy 3: The Dragon's Trap on the Turbografx-16 and PC Engine. Still, for anyone who hasn't played this game yet, I would recommend the modern remake over Dragon's Curse these days, unless you're just a giant PC Engine fan that missed out on this one and wants to see how it was. We took a look at 16 games today that appeared on both the Genesis and the PC Engine, or games where an original appeared on the PC Engine and a sequel showed up on the Genesis. And we put to test the myth that said all or most Sega ports on the PC Engine were superior to the Genesis versions. My final score was that of these 16 games, 12 were better on Genesis, 2 were better on PC Engine, and 2 were a draw. So yeah, I don't even understand where this original myth that these Sega games were better on the PC Engine even came from. As I talked about in looking at some of the games earlier, it might just be the fact that people were discovering these games later and didn't know about them when they were new, and just got a little overexcited about them. Now, in most cases, the PC Engine games were good. They weren't bad, they ranged from decent to very good. There are only a few instances where these Sega games on PC Engine were actively bad, and I would say those cases were Altered Beast, Golden Axe, and Shinobi. So, what about you, dear viewers? What's your opinion on the Sega games that appeared on the PC Engine? Which system do you think had the best versions of Sega games, and why? Please let me know in the comments. I would love to hear what you have to say on this topic. And that'll do it for this video, my retro gaming friends. If you enjoyed the video, please like and share it somewhere. Go ahead and put it into a community or a few on Reddit. Throw it on Instagram. Throw it on Snapchat, on Twitter, anything that you kids use these days that old people like me don't understand. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you'll know when my new videos are released. Lately, for some reason, YouTube hasn't been recommending my videos or letting people know when new ones come out unless they have the notification bell turned on. So if you don't do that, chances are pretty good these days you'll miss a video. Also, if you'd like, you can now support my work on either Patreon or Ko-fi. The links appear both at the end of this video and down below in the description. With that, I'll say thanks for watching, and see me later.